All right. Hello, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Robert Gropp, and I am the Interim Co-Executive Director of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. And I would like to very sincerely welcome you all and thank you all for joining us for today's Leadership in Biology webinar program that is going to explore and share some insights as to the President's FY fiscal year 2017 research and development budget, particularly as it pertains and relates to the biological sciences. These programs are a monthly series of initiatives that AIBS brings to our members and the broader community as a whole. They are in part made possible by the generous support of our individual institutional members and by donors and various supporters of our programs. So to all of them, I say thank you very much. And if you are not currently a member, I invite you to join with us. We also, if you visit our website, you'll see several of our upcoming webinar programs. I'm very happy to say that we're going to have a timely program that's been organized by the editor of our journal Bioscience just next month on the current status of the science related to Zika, and looking at the potential for some genetic control mechanisms, but also the epidemiology and biology of the virus, and some of the ethical considerations related to how it may be managed or controlled. So it's a very timely and important program that I invite you to participate in next month, March 15th. You can register for that program at aibs.org. So with that said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Julie Polakovich-Carr, who is our public policy manager here at the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and she will provide you with today's program and content. So with that, thank you very much. Welcome, and Julie, take it away.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. As Rob said, we're going to be taking a look at President Obama's final budget request, which is for fiscal year 2017, and what it might mean for biological research and education programs. So before we delve into the details of what's been proposed for these science agencies, I thought it would be helpful to provide some background and process about how federal budgets are made. And at the end of the program, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if we don't get to particular programs or agencies that you're interested in during my slides, I'm happy to answer questions at the end. I will just note that at the bottom of your screen, there is a icon for Q&A. You can feel free to type in your questions as we go through the presentation. I won't be checking them till the very end, but that way they'll be queued up for when we get to that portion of the webinar. And if you are having any technical issues, I would encourage you to use the chat box. My colleague Jeff is also on the webinar and can help troubleshoot any issues that you're having. But if you direct those to through the chat box, that's probably the most efficient way to do that. So to start out with, there are a few basic principles that it's helpful to know or to be reminded of when thinking about a president's budget request. And the first is that Congress is the entity that controls expenditures from the federal treasury. That's set up through the Constitution. And so while a president each year does formulate a budget request, it really is a request to Congress. Those lawmakers are the ones that are actually drafting and passing the appropriations bills that set federal funding levels, which then ultimately go to the president for his signature or to be vetoed. The second principle to keep in mind is that federal spending can largely be grouped into two categories: mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending are programs that are created in laws outside of the annual budget and appropriations process. So a lot of the social safety net or entitlement programs that people think of, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, but also certain agriculture subsidy programs are all mandatory spending. So once those programs are authorized into law, unless the underlying laws change, they have to be funded every year. And mandatory spending has been a growing part of the federal budget. It's currently about 60% of federal spending each year. Now, the remaining funds, discretionary spending, are programs and agencies where Congress can set the funding levels each year through the appropriations process. So that's everything from Department of Defense to National Parks and Environmental Conservation, Department of Education, and practically all science programs. So Congress has the ability to say for a particular program, say at EPA, no, we don't like that program anymore, we're not going to fund it this year, or we're going to cut its budget in half, or we're going to increase funding for it. So it's helpful to realize where science fits in terms of overall spending by the federal government. So if you think about a single dollar that you pay in taxes, about a quarter of that dollar goes towards healthcare related programs. About another quarter roughly goes to defense. Less than 20% goes to job and family security. About 8% is interest payments on the national debt. The remaining quarter roughly is all the other programs you can think of, and just a little over 1% is spent on science programs. Now, of course, that isn't a central fund for science. As we're all aware, there are a multitude of federal agencies that support research and development and science education programs, and Congress is making funding decisions not just for each of these agencies, but for many budget lines within the agency. So there's a lot of decision points that are made by lawmakers as they are formulating the spending bills each year. So the basic process for how the federal budget comes together, as I mentioned before, it's an annual decision, and it's for a fiscal year that starts on October 1. So we are currently in calendar year 2016, and as of October 1st, 2015, we're in fiscal year 2016. This fiscal year will end at the end of September. So everything that we're going to be talking about is what's being proposed for fiscal year 2017, which starts this fall. So in an ideal world, the process for putting together the spending bills really starts in the previous year. So last summer, last fall, that's when federal agencies and the President and the Office of Management and Budget were having internal negotiations and planning meetings to figure out what their proposal was going to be for 2017 funding. That's all an internal process. Congress isn't privy to what's happening there. The public isn't privy to what's happening there. But the first Monday in February is when the president is supposed to release his budget request to Congress, and that is a public document. Now this year, the budget was about a week late. It just came out on February 9th. But soon after that budget request comes out, Congress starts holding hearings and markups to figure out, okay, first of all, what is the total top line amount of spending that they want to see for that given year? And that gets formalized in a budget resolution, which is supposed to be completed by April 15th. After that, the House and Senate appropriations committees are able to put together the 12 appropriations bills that collectively fund the variety of federal agencies that are out there. Those bills are drafted, marked up by a subcommittee, then the full appropriations committee go to the House floor, and then follow that same process through the Senate. Typically that's happening through the summer, and then ideally all of that gets wrapped up by the end of September when the fiscal year ends. Now, I started this off by saying in an ideal world, and that's because it's been about 20 years since Congress has been able to complete this process for all 12 appropriations bills before the new fiscal year starts. So they've had to resort to some other tactics in recent years and decades to kind of hold things over so that the government doesn't get shut down, although that did happen in 2013. But that's certainly the time frame that everyone hopes for. So moving away from process now and starting to think about some of the trends that have shaped federal funding in recent years, I think it's helpful to start by kind of looking at kind of longer term trends over multiple decades. So in this graph, we're going to look at federal research and development spending as a share of gross domestic product, so in comparison to the size of the US economy. And so you can see starting back in the mid-1970s to the present day, there's certainly been some ups and downs over different years and different administrations, but we're at a much lower point now as a share of GDP than we were 40 years ago. And this is really in stark contrast to what other nations and other parts of the world are doing, especially when you look to Asia, where they have been aggressively investing in science programs. And one of the constraints in recent years that have really shaped that downturn has to do with the Budget Control Act of 2011. And that law set into place two programs, kind of. One is that it set caps on the total amount of discretionary spending that the federal government could spend or that Congress could allocate each year for a decade. And in addition to those budget caps, there is something called budget sequestration, which you've probably also heard of. So those are additional cuts, that are more strict, more stringent than the budget caps put in place. And sequestration, those cuts are supposed to be equally divided between defense and non-defense programs. And with the exception of the very first year that sequestration was in effect, which was 2013, Congress has been able to decide what programs are going to take a cut. So with the way sequestration is working now, it doesn't mean every program gets cut. Congress certainly can choose certain agencies or programs within agencies that could get an increase, but that means that money has to be made up for somewhere else in the budget. So notably, this past fall, lawmakers were able to reach a deal to lessen the blow of sequestration for fiscal years 2016 and 2017. And in 2016, it actually allowed for overall a 5.2% increase in discretionary spending as compared to fiscal year 2015. So that actually gave a good amount of room for programs to grow. Conversely, for 2017, we're essentially looking at a flat amount of spending available overall as compared to 2016. It's about $3 billion more is available in 2017 as compared to 16. You might say, well, $3 billion, that seems like a decent amount of money. But when you're talking about $1 trillion budget, it essentially means discretionary funding is going to be flat this coming year. So let's start to talk about what President Obama has outlined in his last budget request for his administration. So overall, it is a little over $1 trillion budget in terms of discretionary funding that does adhere to spending cap, sequestration, and the budget deal that was all negotiated in the past, including the deal from this past fall. What is significant, however, is that the administration, in addition to the discretionary funding, is proposing significant amounts of new mandatory spending, including for agencies that either have not received mandatory spending in the past or perhaps received mandatory funds in certain programs, and now the administration is requesting it for other programs that have not historically received mandatory funds. So really, the way you can think about that is it's a way to get around the budget cap and the budget deal and all of that, so they can still comply with the previous agreement, but still outline, ambitious new ways to expand programs. The likelihood of those mandatory funds being allocated or created is fairly unlikely. So as we go through this talk today, I'll be very careful to point out when I'm including the mandatory funds or when I'm not in the proposals. So overall, the president's budget request would provide $152 billion for research and development programs. That's a $6 billion increase. That would be $2 billion in new discretionary funding, $4 billion in new mandatory funding. Most biological science programs would see an increase in discretionary funds under the president's proposal. The other thing I will point out before we start talking about specific agencies is that any changes that I'm talking about are all relative, excuse me, that's a typo, it should be to the 2016 enacted level. So we'll start with the National Science Foundation. The president has requested $7.6 billion, that's about $100 million in new discretionary spending for the agency. In addition, the administration is requesting $400 million in new mandatory spending. They're saying it would be 1 year mandatory spending, and they would like to see those funds directed to supporting early career researchers. if we're just talking about the $100 million in discretionary funds, about a quarter of that would be spent on or directed to the research directorates. There are a number of cross-disciplinary programs within NSF that would receive some new funding. The one that would receive the largest increase is a relatively new program, Innovations at the Nexus of Food, Energy, and Water Systems, which just got off the ground this year. There's about $19 million proposed in new funding for science education programs, including for the NSF Research Traineeships program that benefits graduate students. Although that program is proposed to get a small increase, the Graduate Research Fellowship program would not receive any new funding. And additionally, NSF is looking for some additional funds to help support the relocation of their headquarters within Virginia. That's been kind of an ongoing cost over the last couple of years where they've needed additional funds for that. Looking at the Biological Sciences Directorate within NSF, the proposal is for about $746 million. It's essentially a flat budget compared to 2016. In addition, the administration would like to see about $45 million in new mandatory spending for the Bio Directorate. NSF claims that would support about 200 additional research grants in 2017. And part of the reason that they are requesting those funds has to do with funding rates. Funding rates within the Bio Directorate have been declining for multiple years, but actually in the last couple of years, it seems like they're higher, but it largely has to do with the requirement for grantees to submit pre-proposals. So at this point, NSF is saying that funding rates have become, quote, dangerously low, according to the agency, and so they are hoping to reverse that trend. One of the new initiatives that the Bio Directorate is hoping to launch in the new year is a Rules of Life program that would support research that has to do with some of the physical organizing principles of basically life, DNA, those sorts of things. Most of that support would come from mandatory spending, though. Additionally, one other thing that was notable in the agency's budget request had to do with support for graduate students, and NSF has mentioned that there has been some concerns about the quality of research experience or educational experience that graduate students are getting who are supported on research grants, and they are going to be proposing new limitations on that support for graduate students within research grants. And instead, NSF would like to put more funding and resources towards supporting NSF-sponsored fellowships and traineeships. Not too many details are available at this point in terms of how that would play out, but that's something to look forward to down the road. So lastly, this is just showing the trend in NSF funding going back a little more than 15 years. Of course, with all of these graphs, the 2017 number is what was requested in the president's budget. It hasn't actually happened yet, but it gives you a sense of what it would mean relative to historical funding trends. So NSF has had a fairly steady increase over the years. The big spike in 2009 was from the economic stimulus. You'll see similar spikes in 2009 and sometimes 2010 and some of the other graphs we'll look at for other agencies as we go through the presentation. So next, USDA. We'll highlight two programs there, starting with the Agricultural Research Service, which is USDA's intramural agriculture research program. The president's budget request of $1.3 billion would be a slight cut for the agency, about a $100 million cut. In spite of requesting less funding overall for the program, there are some targeted increases proposed that largely fit with presidential initiatives. For instance, antimicrobial resistance. That has been something that the administration has been pushing for additional funding for across multiple agencies for a couple of years now. There's also new funds proposed for research on avian flu and other foreign animal diseases, as well as research to support more climate resilient agriculture and food systems. The Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, AFRI, is USDA's competitively awarded extramural grants program. And this program would receive $25 million in new discretionary funds in the president's request. In addition, the administration is seeking $325 million in new mandatory spending. So if that actually happened, really what the administration is requesting is a doubling of that program's budget, which would, that $700 million total amount is actually what the program is authorized at. From the Farm Bill. This is a relatively new program. It was created in the 2008 Farm Bill, and historically has not seemed the anywhere near the level of funding that it is authorized to be at. So the new funding would support several priority research areas, including around water management, climate change, food safety, and bioenergy. And as you can see, AFRI funding has been increasing at a decent clip over the past few years since the program was created, but still is well below what the program is authorized to be at $700 million. So the National Institutes of Health, NIH, is looking at about $1 billion cut in discretionary spending. However, this is one of the agencies where a significant amount of new mandatory spending is proposed. NIH already does receive some mandatory spending, but the bulk of its budget comes from discretionary funds. By far the largest increase proposed is for the president's new Cancer Moonshot Initiative, which was announced during the State of the Union address in January. In addition, there are increases proposed for a couple of ongoing programs, the Precision Medicine Initiative, which has to do with individualized medical treatments and diagnoses, and the Brain Initiative, which some other agencies, including NSF, have also been involved with, which aims to better understand the human brain and cognition. Overall, NIH is saying that the budget request would support about 800 fewer competing research grants than in past years, partly because some of the competing grants that were awarded last year are going to be transitioning over to being non-competing grants this coming year, but overall they are looking at their funding rate declining from around 19% down to about 17.5%. NIH is also proposing to support a little over 200 new traineeship positions for early career scientists. And as you can see, NIH funding has been relatively stable for a number of years now, since the economic stimulus in 2009, which was certainly a high point. So the Department of Energy Office of Science, request of $5.6 billion, that's a $225 million increase in discretionary funds. This is another agency where the administration is proposing new mandatory spending. They're requesting $100 million that would go towards university research grants. Again, there's not a lot of details on what that would actually be used for, but that is in addition to the more specific numbers we'll be talking about. So for instance, the $53 million increase for the biological and environmental research program, that would all be discretionary funds, not mandatory funds. And that level of increase would support some targeted increases in a few programs, the first of which is supporting the 3 bioenergy research centers that the administration has been working on for a couple of years now. Another has to do with microbiome research, foundational genomics research, and climate and earth system modeling, which has been another area where there has been targeted funds for increases for the last couple of years. And this is another program where the funding level has been fairly, it's moved around a little bit, but has hovered kind of around that $600 million mark annually. The 2017 proposal would be a significant uptick from that, though. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, their request of $5.9 billion, although it would be a high point for the agency in terms of total funding levels, is actually a much smaller request than they've sought in past years. I will note this is the one agency where that total number and the increase includes both discretionary and mandatory spending, and that is because NOAA has a number of programs, existing programs that are funded with mandatory funds, although there is some new mandatory funding proposed in 2017 to support acquisition of a new research vessel. But overall, NOAA is looking at spending a little more than $500,000 on research, and there are increases proposed once again for various aspects of climate research and ocean acidification, including impacts to fisheries and nearshore waters. There's various programs that would benefit from that overall about $30 million increase. There are some cuts proposed, though, to a few research programs within their ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes research account. Several programs would take small cuts, totaling in all about $10 million that would be cut from those programs. So as I mentioned, NOAA's budget is at a high point now. The 2017 budget would be a high watermark for them. Most of this increase has been driven by the costs of developing and building a few weather and climate satellite programs, which are maturing at this point. So that's why the budget request is a lot smaller for this coming year. But a lot of that increase has been driven by just those procurement costs kind of going up and up. The Environmental Protection Agency is looking at a small increase overall for the agency. The same goes for its science and technology account, about a $20 million increase there. In spite of an overall small increase, a number of programs would take small cuts, including the budget line that includes ecosystem services research. But there are some new increases proposed. The impacts of hydraulic fracturing on air and water quality has been a priority for the agency in their budget request for the last few years, and they're requesting additional funds for 2017 in that area. One new research initiative would complement the President's initiative to double clean energy R&D funding, and the EPA is hoping to do some new research on the impacts of clean fuels on biodiversity, invasive species, and ecosystem health. So overall, science and technology funding at EPA has varied a bit year to year, but has kind of hovered around an average funding level, and this request wouldn't deviate too much from that. So the last agency that we'll look at is USGS, and the request of $1.2 billion is a little more than a $100 million increase in discretionary funds. The ecosystems activity within USGS is also looking at an increase about $14 million in total there, which would support a number of administration priorities. Science in support of critical landscapes was an initiative that really was highlighted in the 2016 budget. That complements work of some other Department of the Interior agencies and would have just help to better manage sage steppe and Arctic ecosystems. USGS is proposing to continue to invest in the area of pollinator health, water management, as well as getting a better understanding and handle on new and emerging invasive species. Notably, the survey is also proposing to establish a new Great Lakes Science Center that would be part of the National Wildlife and Climate Change Science Center consortia. Right now, the Great Lakes are included as part of an existing science center, but they're proposing to split up that area and to create a new science center that would focus more on the Great Lakes and their health as it relates to climate change. So USGS is one of those programs that since sequestration started, and even a little before that, saw their funding cut, and it's been very slow to recover from those levels. But the budget proposal for 2017 certainly would help in that regard. So before we go to Q&A, I want to point out that AIBS has a few other resources that may be helpful to people as you continue to look into the President's budget request and in the future. So just on Monday, we released our analysis of the 2017 budget request and what it means for biological research and science education programs, and you can download a free copy of that on the AIBS website. In addition, we will be continuing to cover this topic as part of our bi-weekly public policy report, and you can also get a free subscription to that electronic newsletter on the AIBS website. We'll be covering as Congress starts to formulate the appropriations bills and as those get enacted as the year goes by. I also want to mention that we do have some upcoming webinars as part of the Leadership in Biology series. So on March 15th will be the webinar that Rob highlighted at the top of the program about using gene drives to counter the Zika virus. And in April, I will be giving a webinar on careers in science policy. And if you're interested in signing up for either or both of those events, the link is here as well. And at this point, I am happy to take questions. Remember, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enter a question in there, and that'll show up on my end. And I will also just mention before we go to Q&A that a recording of this presentation will be available. We will be sending out the link to everyone in the near future, so you will have access to everything here. So at this moment, I do not have any questions in the Q&A box, so I will give everyone a chance to enter those there. I should mention that if there was a particular program or agency that I didn't highlight in my talk that you'd like to know about, I'm happy to try to answer questions on those. I do have some information on additional agencies that I did not include in the presentation that I'd be prepared to talk about. So we just received a question about where can you find budget data online. So at the most basic level, all of the agencies do put out their budget requests as public documents. You can go to an agency's website, and usually it's in their Office of Budget, where you can download a copy of their request. If you're looking for something, these are usually pretty big documents, hundreds and hundreds of pages, sometimes more. If you're looking for something that presents more of a highlight or something like that, I really would encourage you to look at the AIBS analysis that we just put together to get a synopsis. Okay, and we have a second question here. Could you please talk a little about funding for USAID science funding, such as the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity? Charlotte, thank you for that question. I would actually need to check a little bit. That's not something I have at my fingertips at the moment, but my email address is up on the screen. Please shoot me an email, and I'm happy to get an answer to you offline from this webinar. Give it another 30 seconds here to see if any other questions come in. All right, not seeing any further questions. I do encourage people, if you have something that comes to mind, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to be helpful in the future. And I'll just end by saying that we very much appreciate your participation in today's webinar, and we really do want to thank AIBS's organizational members and individual members for supporting programs like this one. And I would encourage people to consider joining AIBS as an individual member. Your membership supports access to programs like this one and many others. But again, thank you for participating in today's webinar. We hope to see you at a future event.